Here we go. So I am going to return on Armistice Day, on a day when we historically think about how awful war is and how grateful we are when it ends. To think today about a war that is, of course, unfolding in real time. The information that we have about it is quite limited. The Israeli Defense Force is essentially imposing a blanket that prevents information from escaping Gaza, except when they wanted to. At least that's what they're trying to do, although it's not thorough. It's not a efficient blockade of all information. What they're trying to prevent is images like the one on the right from getting out and circulating to the rest of the world, as well as preserving their strategic advantage from keeping the forces of Hamas knowing exactly where and what they're doing. What I want to do today, having spoken with you about this in the second week of October as it was unfolding, the initial attacks on Israel by Hamas, we're now a month into the Israeli response, and I will give you a little bit of information about what's happening there. I imagine we're all uh, fixated by this, as awful as it is. It's hard not to pay attention to it. So I will also then try to shift into a longer term perspective and think about how Israel and Palestine got to this situation. And I want to be as clear as possible. I think this is a no-win situation. I think that what Israel is doing right now is manifestly counterproductive in the long term. But on the other hand, irresistible for the government to do. It's a democratic society, and this is what the people demand. It's related to the very reason for existence of Israel, that it avenge itself, that it do its best to degrade and dismantle the capacity of Hamas to do something like this again. And yet the consequence of doing it will almost certainly be that Hamas and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism will be stronger when this campaign is over. Maybe not immediately, maybe not the month that the campaign ends, but within a year or 5 years of its ending. One of the things that has been learned from studying so-called asymmetrical warfare, where a military is fighting a non-military terrorist organization, is that when the military inflicts high civilian casualties, which it's very difficult for it not to do, it then acts as a recruiter, as a agent that underlines the reasons why terrorism is justified in the first place. And so for each civilian killed, and please let us note that we don't have precise numbers, but certainly thousands of civilians, thousands of children have died in Gaza over the last month. For each of those civilians, it is likely that 2 or 3 more Palestinians will be radicalized, that other people in other parts of the world, Arabs and Muslims, but maybe not exclusively Arabs and Muslims, will also come to view Israel as an inhumane colonial occupier, as opposed to an indigenous people of the region who need to find some way to work with the other indigenous peoples of the region. And so just to start with the obvious, and this diagram is now completely out of date, but we're seeing levels of fatality and injury in this region that have not been seen for decades. You have to go back to the 1970s to find similar levels of violence, death, suffering. We are getting more and more information about the brutality of the attack on Israel by Hamas as well. That people were not just killed in combat, but were hunted and were subdued and were bound and were tortured before being burned alive, dismembered, raped, executed in front of their own relatives, right? And so I think the depravity of the Hamas attack, the clear effort to trigger in Israel the trauma of the repeated efforts to do violence to the Jews that go back obviously to the Holocaust and before that to pogroms, to the long history of anti-Semitism, to the vulnerability of a people without a state, right? And Hannah Arendt herself, a victim of the Holocaust, although not an ultimate victim, someone who escaped but became a refugee and stateless before uh, settling in the United States, spoke of the need to have a state as a precondition of the right to have rights in the modern world. And so Israel as a state exists so that the kind of thing that happened in the Holocaust, that happened in the pogroms, that has happened repeatedly in Jewish history will not occur again, which is not that violence won't be done to Jews by anti-Semites, right? But that Jews will not be defenseless. And yet on October 7th, essentially Jews were defenseless and it was done again. And so you understand why Israeli Jews feel the imperative to respond in a way that makes it clear that Israel is not helpless and that Hamas will not be allowed to do this again. And yet, when you look at the level of civilian suffering being imposed on the residents of the Gaza Strip. Remember, this is an area roughly the size of Manhattan with over 2 million people living in it, and they are being deprived of water, of food, of medicine. They are in their hospitals, forced to do surgery on children without anesthetic. They are on the cusp, the UN thinks, of some major health emergencies, an outbreak of cholera, given that they do not have fuel to run their salination plants, they don't have access to clean water in the quantity required to drink, let alone to wash hands and bathe. There are over 1 million displaced people crowded into schools and tents and hospitals. The conditions are ripe for the spread of disease. And I think it is absolutely clear under the definition of crimes of war and crimes against humanity that Israel is now engaged in criminal and inhumane uh, a campaign that cannot be justified. And yet it's impossible, I think, for the Israelis to act without doing this kind of harm as well. And so I will return to this. This is a no-win situation for Israel. And just as much as it's a no-win situation for Israel, it's obviously a terrible, awful situation for the Palestinians of Gaza, right? And so we just need to recognize that in order to ask the question, and I think really there are two questions: how did we get to the place, right? How did they get to the place where this is happening? And what can be done to avoid a repetition of this in the future? And so that's where I will focus today. I will just point out, right, that the first wave of the Israeli attack on Hamas was to try to bomb in order to disrupt and degrade its capacity to defend itself. The result is, depending upon who you listen to, maybe a quarter, maybe a third, maybe a half of the structures in northern Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. And just to give a sense of the nature of the conflict, right? And we've talked about this before, right? Hamas locates a planning facility or a command center or a munitions depot in the middle of a civilian neighborhood. If you're going to bomb that facility, which is probably hard and maybe even right camouflage as a tunnel where the true operations are, in order to take it out, in order to prevent Hamas from using it as you prepare for a ground invasion, you have to unleash serious damage onto it, right? And when you do that, what happens is that the surrounding area is also damaged, right? And so a whole block is destroyed, a block that has families, civilians living side by side with the Hamas militants. And so this is the nature of the first wave of the campaign. The second wave has now begun, and this is a ground assault, right? And it's a ground invasion that's been underway for about 10 days now. And as you can see, right, in particular, it appears 3 columns of tanks and military vehicles trying to surround Gaza City so that there's no egress above ground. But here is where I think things immediately reveal themselves to be so difficult, perhaps impossible for the Israelis to prevail, because there is a network of tunnels, an absolute hive of tunnels underneath the Gaza Strip, hundreds of miles of intricately dug and planned and interconnected tunnels, such that although moving on the ground can prevent egress on the ground, it cannot prevent the Hamas militants from getting underground and very quickly relocating, blending back in with the civilian population, popping up to fight, and then immediately disappearing again. And so when we look at what the Israelis are trying to accomplish, right, that they're coming in with tanks and military personnel vehicles, and they are right surrounding Gaza City, taking over the northern half of the Gaza Strip. But that's not going to accomplish very much. Either they're going to have to get down in the tunnels and actually fight Hamas in an area that has been booby trapped, that it has the maps for and the plans for, and it has mastered. And the Israelis are fighting in terrain that they really don't understand and that eliminates their asymmetrical strategic advantage. Hamas doesn't have tanks, but tanks don't go underground. Or else, and this seems to be the announced Israeli strategy, they're not going to directly engage in combat in the tanks, in the tunnels, sorry, but then the announced mission, and there's ambiguity here. The official line of the Israeli Defense Forces, of the government, of the military spokespeople, is that they are going to destroy Hamas. The obvious response to this is that Hamas cannot be destroyed, right? Hamas's leadership is in Qatar, it's in Iran, it's in Egypt, it's in tunnels. It cannot be taken out via a ground invasion in Gaza. The additional aspect of this, though, is that even if, suppose what is impossible, that Israel actually succeeds in destroying not only the leadership, but the entire militia of Gaza, there is, it seems to me, no chance that Hamas doesn't rethink form, doesn't grow again, perhaps even in a more powerful form as a result of the large number of civilian casualties Israel inflicts on the people of Gaza in order to destroy Hamas. But now let's get real. It can't be done. So what's really being done is Hamas is being degraded, right? Its capacity to launch another attack is being undermined. And here again, I think the same thing applies, which is to say that um, yes, in the short term, you can limit Hamas's capacity to strike Israel. Certainly, you can degrade its capacity to plan another attack akin to the attack of October 7th, but that's only in the short term, right? How long is Israel going to remain in Gaza? How long is it going to expose its soldiers to ambush and attack? How long is it going to bear the cost? How long is it going to continue to foment international condemnation, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism on the Arab street, potentially destabilizing some of the regimes that have recently recognized it? It doesn't work long term for Israel to remain in Gaza. It has to withdraw from Gaza. When it withdraws, Hamas will reform. And so this is a mission with unacceptable costs in both humanitarian and strategic terms. I'm not saying that there's a better alternative. I am saying that this is a losing strategy and unacceptable in humanitarian terms. And those two are directly related to each other because there is no way to fight this war without doing unacceptable, and I don't want to use the military speak, collateral damage, without unacceptable levels of civilian casualties, of perfectly innocent babies and children, of people who don't support Hamas, suffering and dying, injury, maiming, and disease. For that very reason, Hamas and its cause, the idea of Hamas, the idea of, to be as clear as possible, armed resistance against Israeli occupation of both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and ultimately of the territory from the Jordan River to the sea, that armed resistance will grow in strength as a result of the short-term effort to degrade or destroy Hamas. And so this then gets us to the fundamental dilemma, right? Which is to say that Israel finds itself in need of defending itself, but defends itself via a path that ultimately causes unacceptable levels of civilian casualties, and in so doing strengthens the very organization it is trying to degrade or destroy. And please note that's not all, right? Which is to say there are deep risks of escalation of the violence in this conflict, risks that come from the West Bank. And this is the growth in the number of conflicts since October 7th on the West Bank. There have been hundreds of Palestinians killed on the West Bank as well. The increase in violence in the West Bank makes it much more likely that Hezbollah on the northern border with Lebanon is going to be pulled into this conflict. And as you can see, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have evacuated the northern border with Lebanon due to fairly constant missile strikes from Hezbollah and the ongoing exchange of artillery from the Israeli Defense Forces and the Hezbollah fighters. And Hezbollah so far has been relatively restrained, has not launched an all-out war, and if it does if that occurs, which what's happening in the West Bank, what's happening in Gaza increases the likelihood, then the Israeli military is stretched very thin, right? It probably has to redeploy forces from Gaza back to the north of Israel, and the likelihood that Iran or Syria or Yemen is drawn into this conflict, the likelihood that this begins to generate instability in Egypt or Jordan grows, right? And I want to be as clear as possible, right? That these are the images from a mile away of Israeli bombs falling on Gaza City, from 100 feet up, the destroyed buildings, the people who survived desperately digging through the wreckage to try to find anybody who survived, as well as to bury the dead, and the close up of the mother grieving the killed baby. As these images circulate, which they will do in an uncontrolled way, in a way without context or explanation, in a way deliberately designed to inflame people, the pressure for Hezbollah, Syria, Iran to get involved grows, right? And so again, I think that the short-term perspective is something has to be done about Hamas. It's a murderous terrorist organization that just conducted a brutal, awful, barbaric attack. And yet, what is being done makes those attacks and makes a broader war all the more likely. So, with that context, I want to now. I'm sorry. With the focus on the short term, I now want to pull back to longer term context and to begin uh, trying to provide some analysis of how um, this situation spiraled so deeply out of control, and sorry, what we might be doing uh, differently in the future if we don't want this to repeat. So the first thing to understand is the nature of Hamas. And here I'm going to emphasize two aspects of Hamas. The first is that it is the Palestinian organization committed to armed conflict. There is scholarship on this, which I think is quite illuminating, that suggests that armed conflict in this region, whether it is a uprising, an intifada, whether it is a terrorist attack, whether it is Israeli armed punishment of those who are engaged in the uprising or the terrorism, has actually been the precondition for most of the progress that's been made in this region. And so it doesn't fit the Gandhian model of peaceful resistance. And on the other hand, the Palestinian Authority, which has in the Oslo Accords acknowledged the right of Israel to exist, has engaged in international agreements and continues to take the diplomatic path, sees very little reward for its efforts over the last 20 years. And I'll get into Netanyahuism in a moment, but the idea that the Israeli governments over the last 15 years, primarily under the leadership of Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu, have essentially done everything they can to undermine the Palestinian Authority because they don't want a two-state solution, has given further credibility to the idea that it's only through armed resistance that the Palestinian cause can be furthered. You add to that, and again, I'm doing my best. I assume that for many of us, the Israeli perspective is the perspective that we perhaps have a better understanding, perhaps some greater sympathy for, to make clear the Palestinian perspective as well. I don't mean to fully endorse it, but it needs to be intelligible if we're going to figure out how to cope with and potentially resolve or at least reconcile the sides in this situation. So the second aspect of Hamas vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority is that it is a homegrown or indigenous political formation, that the PLO, which becomes the Palestinian Authority, was a group of exiles, of expats, primarily located out of Paris, that came to Palestine once there was an accord, right? That it does not have the same perhaps street level of credibility that Hamas has, as a result of the fact that Hamas was actually originally organized in Gaza and to varying degrees the West Bank as well, I think is extremely important, again, to understanding the nature of Hamas. And here I think we then have to recognize that the combination of the Netanyahu government, the most recent Netanyahu government, of the green light that it's given to settlers to occupy and then expropriate territory in the West Bank, combined with the apparent reconciliation between the Saudis and Israel as the Abraham Accords were to be extended and there was going to be diplomatic recognition, one of the chief objectives of the Biden administration's diplomacy in the region. This combination gave rise to the fear on the part of Hamas that essentially it was being abandoned by most of the Arab world, that the conditions for any possible formation of a Palestinian state were receding to the point of vanishing, that the members of the Netanyahu government who called for a second Nakba, what in Arabic means disaster or catastrophe, a second episode of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their ancestral territory was underway and might very well be accomplished. That Netanyahu's government's push against tremendous internal Israeli opposition to eliminate judicial checks on its efforts to expropriate Palestinian territory in the West Bank meant that it was about to enter a period when it would be unbridled in its efforts to accomplish the same. This is to say that Hamas, at least factions within Hamas, saw this as a moment of existential threat. And I return again to Hannah Arendt and to this phrase, right? The right to have rights depends on having a state. I'm going to use an example that is, I hope, not a trivializing example. There are a European people called the Wends. I doubt any of us has ever really heard of them unless you read the obscure literature on nationalism that I sometimes read, right? And this is a people, they were in Belgium, they were in the Netherlands, they were in southern Germany. 600, 700 years ago, they considered themselves a distinct ethno-linguistic group, and they never got a state, right? And the result is that they don't exist as an ethnic, as a linguistic group anymore. They're a footnote in history, right? And so what happens to a people without a state? Not only do they not have the right to have rights, not only do they live in what is being called by Amnesty International an open air prison, and what increasingly resembles an open air morgue in Gaza, because nobody stands up for them. Eventually, they perish as a distinct people. And Hamas saw that this was their future, the future of the Palestinians, and they sought desperately and brutally and through totally inhumane, unconscionable means to bring the Palestinian question back to the forefront of world attention. That is what they did on October 7th. And frankly, one of the places we have to point blame at when we ask ourselves, how did this happen? Is the Netanyahu government, is Israel? Because not only is this the barbaric incursion of Hamas, this is also the complete and dismal failure of the Israeli security services and military to protect itself. And so how did that happen? And that's the second question I want to pose and begin to think through as we think through why this happened and how we might be able to avoid something like this in the future. And so the first thing to notice is that the Israeli military had deployed a substantial portion of the resources that would normally protect its southern territory from an incursion in Gaza, from Gaza to the West Bank, right? And they had done so because they anticipated it was the Simchat Torah holiday, the weekend of October 7th, that as has happened in the past, settlers would go on rampages and that there would be settler-Palestinian conflicts and the military would need to pacify those conflicts. And so the vast bulk of the troops and equipment that would typically be stationed in the South had been redeployed in the West. And why was that occurring? And I will show you some data on this in a few minutes. It was occurring in part because the settlers felt so emboldened because of the Netanyahu government, right? And so one aspect of this is simply that the policy of slowly settling in order to expropriate the territory of the West Bank took Israeli attention and resources away from another area where they were vulnerable. But there's a second, deeper aspect to this. And the intelligence, I think, is increasingly clear now. The Israeli intelligence services knew Hamas was planning this attack, was rehearsing this attack, was above ground showing how they intended to carry out this attack. And so I don't think it's fair to say that this attack completely surprised the Israeli security services. The failure was not a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of analysis. It was misunderstanding the nature of Hamas and assuming that Hamas, because it was also engaged in ruling Gaza, because it was receiving hundreds of millions of dollars from Iran and Qatar, because its leadership was enriching itself with this money, but also able to run its administration with these resources, had become more interested in governing and the benefits, the largesse that came with governing than it was in armed struggle. And I want to say that on the one hand, in retrospect, it's a lot easier to identify this, obviously. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of Hamas in ways that we've just talked about. But it was a misunderstanding that was extremely convenient for Israeli policy. It was convenient because it allowed the military to concentrate on defending the settlers in the West Bank, but it was also convenient to assume that the Palestinian problem could be sidelined at the cost of occasional missile exchanges, right? What another scholar calls a kind of equilibrium of violence. And I'll just note, I'm drawing in part on some of the interviews that Ezra Klein has done recently, which I find to be enormously helpful on this topic, especially this subject. And so it fed the Netanyahu government's idea that the Palestinian situation could be managed simply by keeping Gaza contained, an ongoing siege in which people nor goods were allowed to move between Israel and the Gaza Strip, and done so without substantial risk to Israeli security, right? And if you view Hamas as more interested in governing than fighting, then that seems like a sensible policy. But frankly, at some point, the desire to have this policy seems to have so deeply shaped the Israeli perception of Hamas that they let their guard down. And so this then uh, helps us, I think, to transition into what I'm calling Netanyahuism, not something that's said very much in the US, but apparently quite common in Israel. And I want to understand its nature in order to understand how not only Hamas and Iran and some of the Arab street and obviously Palestinian politics are responsible for October 7th, but also how Israel is responsible, not only indirectly by failing to protect itself, by creating the conditions in which this kind of attack could be so uh, awfully destructive, but also in the longer term by actually allowing Hamas to gain the authority, the resources, the legitimacy and credibility to conduct this kind of attack. And so the first thing to see is that Netanyahu, in multiple closed door meetings, has said that he considers Hamas to be a better partner for Israel than the Palestinian Authority. And that is precisely because the Palestinian Authority is committed to a two-state, solution, whereas Hamas is committed to the destruction of Israel. Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution, and so having a partner that rejects a two-state solution is better for him. And the policy of allowing Qatar to provide hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to Hamas was clearly courted and ultimately authorized by the Israeli government. And this goes hand in hand with a policy of deliberately undermining the Palestinian Authority so that the only viable partner for any kind of agreement that might result in a permanent solution, not ongoing Israeli occupation, which again, under international law, is clearly problematic. The territories captured 50 years ago are still under Israeli control or not returned either to the country from which they were captured or allowed to form a sovereign territory for the Palestinians. This is highly problematic from a legal point of view, from a moral point of view, and also I'm suggesting from a strategic perspective. But because this is the policy of Netanyahu's government, it becomes the case that his government strengthens Hamas, weakens the Palestinian Authority in order to create conditions in which it's impossible to envision any sort of settlement other than ongoing occupation. Third element of this policy is starving Gaza, right? And we spoke a little bit about this a few weeks ago. I'll represent that data again in a moment, but an ongoing economic blockade means that there's no opportunity for an indigenous economy to take hold. That this policy is sometimes referred to as de-development, the opposite of development. It's a policy of deliberately making the inhabitants of Gaza completely and utterly dependent on foreign aid to have gas, food, water, medicine, to have no prospect of any kind of domestic economic activity producing any kind of viable, sustainable economy because there's no capacity to trade, to export, to do anything with more developed parts of the world. And so the combined effect of these policies is that there's no partner to negotiate with. And so the Palestine issue can be sidelined or ignored. And instead, rapprochement with Arab neighbors can be pursued. And so this is the core of Netanyahu's vision of foreign policy: marginalize Palestine, get recognition from the Saudis, from other Arab and Islamic countries, and then Israel will clearly have its right to exist and not have to worry about a Palestinian state on its border. And I want to suggest again, easier to say in retrospect, but I will point out that there have been many on the Israeli left saying this for over a decade now. This is a recipe perhaps for short-term success, but it is a long-term disaster, assuming that the Palestinians aren't just going to go away, that there needs to be some long-term strategy, or eventually there's going to be another uprising, another terrorist attack. And this is inevitable if you deprive people of hope, of opportunity, of agency, of freedom, of self-determination. If you prevent them from having the right to have rights, then eventually they are going to turn to violence as their only capacity for agency and action. So um, I'm now going to just point out, right, that the obvious and stuff that we've talked about before, which is to say, on the one hand, Gaza became a welter of human misery, and this is before the Israeli attacks, right? And it's combined forces that produce this. Hamas's corrupt rule means that a large portion of the money coming in from Qatar and Iran doesn't go to the people of Hamas. It goes to the militants of, I'm sorry, it doesn't go to the people of Gaza, it goes to the militants of Hamas. Yet the Israeli policy also of so-called shrinking the conflict or mowing the grass is one not of alleviating conflict, but of barely ameliorating the misery of the people in the Gaza Strip. This cultivates the unrest, the support for Hamas, and that reinforces the need to maintain a physical barrier between Gaza and Israel. And that means that there can be no economic activity, hence no end to the misery, right? So this is a self-reinforcing policy, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It is a cynical policy to impose, one that in the short term justifies itself, but in the long term produces things like we see on October 7th. The other aspect of this, right, is that in the West Bank, there is an ongoing policy of annexation and dispossession that completely ignores the rights and, frankly, in the way that a Haaretz editorial put it, the existence of Palestinians. And so again, to just provide a little bit more context here, I'm not sure. Maybe I shouldn't do this given the limits of time, but I want to note, I think, one thing that is extremely important in all of this, right? And this has to do with the first Intifada, the Oslo Accords, the second Intifada, and the coming into power of Netanyahu and the collapse of the Israeli left, and with it, the collapse of the very idea of the possibility of peace. And so the first Intifada, sometimes called the Intifada of Stones, begins in 1987, continues through 1991. And this is, right, almost exclusively Palestinian youth, often teenage young men, throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers in Gaza, in the West Bank, and so completely asymmetrical. The Israelis are armed with automatic weapons, and it results ultimately in the election of a left-wing labor government that negotiates the Oslo Accords and begins to take steps on the way to peace. And so um second intifada, and I'm going to be very brief here, but recognize, right, that there are ongoing negotiations in the aftermath of the Oslo Accord at Camp David, in the UN, in Switzerland, etc., trying to secure a two-state solution. And the Israelis feel, and there's competing narratives here, but I think in a sense, in this situation, as opposed to trying to decide what the right narrative is, it's better to recognize that each side has its narrative, and that narrative is essential to understanding why it acts the way it acts. So you give credibility to the narrative, at least for interpretive purposes, to understand why Israeli politics moved so far to the right in the early 2000s, right? And so there's this effort to create a two-state solution. The Israelis believe that they offered a fair and good deal to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority refuses the deal, probably a negotiating ploy, but at almost the same time the Second Intifada begins. The Second Intifada is the Intifada of suicide bombing, right? And it's important to remember, right? This is a period when, in the early 2000s, many Israelis felt that simply going out in public, going to a cafe, riding a bus, was taking your life into your own hands, that you said goodbye to your children when they went off to school in the morning, as if you maybe would never see them again. And again, this is in the context of a society that is founded in order to protect the Jewish people from anti-Semitic genocidal rage in the aftermath of the Holocaust. It triggers, right, the sense that perhaps for the first time, Israel and Jews were getting over this idea that we are permanently at risk of genocidal violence. And then the Second Intifada breaks out in the immediate aftermath of what Israelis consider to be good faith efforts to offer the Palestinians a fair deal. The big, difficult breaking point in these negotiations is ultimately the right to return. Do the Palestinians have a right to return to territories in what would remain Israel, which had been theirs historically, right? And Israel balks at that, and right, for reasons, again, I don't want to endorse, but I think you can understand, which is to say, Israel considers itself to be a Jewish state. And if Palestinians are, Israel also considers itself to be a democracy. I think we've got to have both of those factors in play. It's a very difficult thing to do, to be a Jewish democracy at the same time, given the demographics of the region. There are already 2 million Arab Israelis, right? Roughly 20% of the population of Israel is not Jewish. If there's a right to return, very quickly, you can see Jews becoming a minority in Israel. They don't, they can't accept that as a position in these negotiations. What they get rewarded with for offering what they think of as a fair peace deal is suicide bombings that continue over the course of 5 years. They leave the Gaza Strip, Hamas takes over, but in this same period, the left essentially collapses. And the sense is that the left just failed, right? That they offered peace to the Palestinians, and the Palestinians don't want peace. They reward Israel with a sustained campaign of suicide bombings. And so again, I think thinking about the context then and getting an understanding of how hard this is to resolve is extremely important. I'll be very brief on this. I just have shown you this before, but the growth of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, the growth of the settler population in the West Bank, the rapid rise in settler attacks against Palestinians, and the use of those attacks to expropriate Palestinian land and the military as an instrument of this, I think is extremely important to understand. Um, I'm running low on time. I'm going to push through these slides. Let me not spend a lot of time with Benny Morrison, the very important historian, a dissident historian with Israel, focusing just for a minute on the economic data and the extreme poverty and misery of Gaza. And right, these diagrams, in addition to providing a bunch of information about just how desperate the poverty is, also show how much poorer, right, Gaza is relative to the West Bank, right? That's what these comparisons are designed to show. And so you're talking about an area where per capita income is less than half of an already poor and besieged area, the West Bank, right? And so again, I think this is important to understanding the context. Let me, yeah, I'm sorry. Let me conclude, and I will come out of the slides here, just by noting that the situation that Israel faces right now is a situation where it cannot win, right? It has to defend itself against Hamas, but in doing so, it almost necessarily creates conditions in which Hamas will be stronger in 5 years, in 10 years than it is today, right? And so that's the first element of this. But second of all, what I've tried to do is describe the situation in the longer term perspective in which Israel has for 15 years since Benjamin Netanyahu has been the dominant figure in Israeli politics, in essence, strengthened Hamas so as not to have a partner for a two-state solution, and done so in a very cynical, calculated way. And that one lesson I think that comes out of this is that the strategy that has been pursued by Benjamin Netanyahu cannot succeed, right? The strategy of simply trying to maintain permanent occupation, slowly pushing Palestinians out of significant portions of the West Bank, of maintaining Gaza in blockade conditions, this will produce violence against Israel and violence against Jews. And so the strategy has to be different going forward. And this raises the question, how can it be different? And I'm not going to provide an easy or pat answer to that. But it seems to me that Netanyahu's days in power are obviously limited. As soon as this war is over, his support level is less than 20% in Israel right now. His rival Gantz is over 50%. It's extremely likely that there will be elections, that Netanyahu will be blamed for the abysmal security failure of October 7th, and that he will end up in court, maybe in jail, rather than in power. But so what does the next government do? And here I think it's essential that the next government recognize that the policy of the last 20 years is a self-defeating policy. They have to show themselves not only to be so powerful that they should never be attacked, but also sufficiently humane that they can be regarded as a potential partner in negotiations and ultimately some kind of settlement to this conflict. That means after devastating Gaza, Israel, not the Arabs, has to take responsibility for rebuilding Gaza. That Israel has to create conditions where the Gazans don't suffer in the way that they've suffered, where they ultimately can have access to Israel for jobs, for goods, for markets, for infrastructure. And that means that the Israelis have to create conditions where they don't fear the Gazans. And then one has to also hope that the spasm of violence that the attacks of October 7th have unleashed ultimately show the Palestinians that the path they're on is not sustainable, does not work, generates too much misery to maintain. There is obviously a world of problems on the Palestinian side. The Palestinian Authority is corrupt and illegitimate. It's worse than a gerontocracy in terms of its leadership. It too needs to be reconstituted, and Israel can't do that on its own. It has to be met halfway by by a new generation of Palestinian leadership that takes over and hopefully begins to identify a different path. I'm not able to outline what that path will be. What I can say with, I think, great clarity is that the path of the last 20 years has not worked, that it almost inevitably brought us to where we are now. And so we need to find a different way forward. I'll stop there. I appreciate your letting me speak passionately, directly, probably dishearteningly about these topics. I want to hear what you have to say as well. Who wants to start us out today? Stunned silence. I don't like that. Anybody have a question or a thought? I can't tell. Barbara, you're not raising your hand, are you? You just, okay. Wilma, you go.
I want to thank you, David, for taking on this topic and for being as articulate and insightful as you have been. Many of us have known all along from the beginning that Netanyahu's policies could only fail. You can't make friends by burning down homes and destroying homes. The only way Israel can exist is if she has good relationships with her neighbors. And thank God there have still been people in Israel who were devoted to that and doing wonderful work to build those relationships. But if the right people don't prevail now, and if policies, it may be too late to change policies, in which case Israel as a nation is doomed. And I don't know what that means for the diaspora.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I heard one Israeli commentator interviewed on this, and he pointed out that he believes that what Israel is doing right now is prompting anti-Semitism throughout the world, right? And
we see that. We see that
clearly.
But it isn't just related to what Israel's doing now. There's Trump and Trumpism, and one of their foundations is anti-Semitism. As they empower the Christian right. So it's coming at us from a lot of different directions.
There's social media,
Yes.
which allows, right, for these ideas to circulate, for people to congregate around them, for the kinds of myths and lies that tend to support anti-Semitism to gain traction. And so there's that, and then there's the growth of ethno-nationalism. And I think we have to be clear, right, that we're in a moment of rising ethno-national populism that often takes on a racial cast, and that the standard ploy, the calling card of European, especially ethno-nationalism, for 150, 200 years now at least, has been anti-Semitism, right? And so the question here is whether Israel begins to see itself as responsible not only for Jews in Israel, but also for Jews in the diaspora, and responsible, therefore, for doing its best to contain anti-Semitism, and starts to recognize that its current policies, as opposed to containing anti-Semitism, provoke not only anti-Zionism, but also anti-Semitism, and therefore sees the imperative of changing course. And I do think that one, and frankly the more likely scenario in light of the invasion of Gaza, is this ongoing escalating spiral of vengeance, revenge, repaying each other, and each escalating, right? Because you always perceive the harm done to you as greater than the harm you've done, and you therefore want to reply with still greater harm, right? And so the question is whether we can make the idea that, as tempting as that path is, it is ultimately a cul-de-sac. And it's a cul-de-sac that threatens the very existence of Israel. It's a cul-de-sac that threatens the very idea of a society founded on humanitarian, democratic, legal ideals. It pushes Israel in the direction of doing the kind of violence that it was founded to be able to resist, right? And so I can only do my best to make the case. And Wilma, I appreciate what you said at the beginning. I'm doing my best to be honest, to be direct, to give a little bit of a voice to perspectives that I think are ultimately awful perspectives, because in so doing, we begin to build the necessary understanding to figure out how to get out of this. I'm reminded of, and then I could talk about the Irish in the 1980s, or the South Africans in the 1980s and 1990s. We could talk about American racists in the South in the Jim Crow period, periods in which people who live side by side have almost no contact with each other and are therefore able to demonize each other. And I think one of the awful things about the cordoning off of Gaza is that for the Gazans, for the Palestinians confined in that open air prison, Israeli Jews are only soldiers, border patrol, imprisoners, snipers, right? That they're not people. And it makes it very easy to demonize them. And for the Israeli Jews, there are Palestinian Israelis. And I do think that helps to humanize, but they're not enough. The contact isn't sustained enough, isn't regular enough to allow them to have some kind of reconciliation, recognition, and taunt understanding of each other. To recognize the humanity of the other is the fundamental challenge here. And so giving voice to their perspectives is a first step along that line, as well as recognizing that apartheid, segregation, violence, containment do not work, right? In the short term, they may be a good strategy for getting elected in the aftermath of a barbaric attack or suicide bombings in the long term, it's a self-defeating strategy. Flossie, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself. I know. You're still muted, Flossie. You have to hold the space bar down or push the.
No,
There you go. You got it now.
it tells me that Trump cannot succeed because he is a crook and a criminal. Netanyahu cannot succeed because his leadership is based on his own criminality. You have to have an honest man in charge to start this negotiation.
Or woman.
Yes, thank you, Wilma. Yeah, and so on the one hand, right, and you know, the depth of the depravity and incompetence of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think it's hard to get our hands around. I think it's going to be history that will ultimately write the full narrative of his story. And yet he is still the prime minister of Israel, right? And until he is no longer the prime minister of Israel, there's little chance of any progress being made. But having said that, I think it's worthwhile noting that he has been the dominant figure in Israeli politics for 15 years. And I think it's worthwhile noting that Donald Trump has in many ways been the dominant figure in American politics for the last 8 years. And so this is a liability of democracy. We sometimes elect very good people, leaders that rise to the challenges of the moment. But frankly, we sometimes elect very bad people who set us down paths that are disastrous, right? And so agreed that we won't have progress until Netanyahu and his ilk are gone. Not necessarily agreed that being a criminal or a liar or inhumane or short-sighted disqualifies one from leadership in democratic politics. Unfortunately, as often as not, it seems to be what people are looking for, alas. All right, everyone. So difficult topic today. Thank you for the good questions. Thank you for the attention. And now that I know that last week's lecture was mainly not heard, we'll go back to that topic, assuming everything cooperates. We can talk about democracy's dysfunction as perhaps government begins to close down next week. Take care of yourselves, be well, take your antidepressants, and I will see everybody next week. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure
Thank
as
you.
always. Sorry the news is so grim. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.